The speaker, Isabelle Brajer, is at the National Museum of Denmark, where she has been since the year 2000, Senior Research Conservator. Her field of specialization is wall painting, conservation, and restoration. From 2009, she's also been the freelance conservator at the Uluru National Park in Australia, where she has been offering advice on Aboriginal rock art. Between 2009 and 2014, she served as an adjunct professor in the School of Conservation in Copenhagen. She has a Master of Fine Arts in Conservation and a Master of Fine Arts in Painting, both from the Academy of Fine Arts in Krakow. She's the author in 2002 of a book, The Transfer of Wall Paintings, based on Danish experience, and editor of a publication in 2013 on the history of conservation in the 19th century. She's been very active internationally. Between 2008 and 2014, she was the coordinator of the Conservation Committee of ICOM and their working group on theory and history in conservation and restoration. And prior to that, between 2005 and 2008, she was the coordinator of the working group on mural paintings, mosaics, and rock art for ICOM. It's a pleasure to present her speaking today, Mistakes and Controversial Treatments on Wall Paintings. Welcome.
Thank you, Peter, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak here today. So my talk is going to focus on controversial treatments on wall paintings, in which mistakes, oversights, bad communication, and outright ignoring of recommendations occurred. These controversial treatments, carried out with the noble intent of preventing a destruction of a painting, of saving as much as possible of the material substance or the pictorial contents, fundamentally and permanently change the character of the painting. Now, I'll be showing you examples where a mistake occurred during a controversial project, or a mistake occurred prior to a controversial project which required the controversial project. And while I'm showing you these case stories, I would like you to contemplate the broader concept of authenticity. I'm speaking of the definition of authenticity as expressed in the Nara document on authenticity, which followed the conference in Japan in 1994. In which the conventional concept of authenticity, that of the material substance, was challenged and widened to include other aspects, such as, apart from the material and substance, to include form and design, use and function, tradition, technique, location, context, even such esoteric concepts as the authenticity of spirit and feeling could be taken into account in the planning and implementation of a conservation project. Now, the Nara document on authenticity stresses that access to truthful source material is a requisite to assess these various forms of authenticity. So I will be revisiting this topic at the end of my talk. Anyway, to make a long story short, the medical examiner who performed your autopsy was fired. We all make mistakes, but we conservators do not like to talk about them. In fact, it usually takes a solidly placed workhorse nearing the end of his or her career to openly talk about things that went wrong. The conservation profession emanates an aura of perfection. Well, let me tell you the story of my mistake. It takes place in Morslet Church. The story starts in 1985, 2 years before I was hired to work as a conservator at the National Museum of Denmark. During some routine maintenance work in the interior of the church, wall paintings were discovered on the north wall around the epitaphium. In fact, 2 layers of wall paintings were found. The older painting was around 800 years old from the Romanesque period, and the more recent painting on top was a decorative painted drapery around the commemorative stone. Such painted draperies were very common in the 18th century, but were almost all destroyed in the eagerness to show the older paintings beneath. And there are not many examples remaining. Here's one from Sennels Church. So in Morslet, a decision was made to uncover the older painting by detaching the painted drapery. The plan was to move the epitaphium to the opposite wall in the church and mount the detached drapery along with it there. Thus, both paintings could be preserved. Now, when I'm talking about detaching the wall painting, I'm talking only about a millimeter or two thick layer of paint along with the lime wash support layer, or a lime wash ground layer. Detaching is done by applying a strong facing to the surface of the painting, and one of the most popular adhesives is a water-soluble animal skin glue, which is applied together with tissue and canvas and cotton gauze, as was done in this case. And here are my colleagues, Mette Jensen and Kirsten Taberdach, who are removing the painted drapery. It was removed in 5 pieces to expose the older painting. Here's where I come into the picture. The very first job I received when I was employed at the museum was to finish the transfer of the painted drapery. It was stored for 2 years with the facing attached, and it had deformed. So one of the first things I did was to stabilize it on a stretcher. And I built a support out of honeycomb plates, and I mounted the fragments of the painted drapery. And here is the piece that is retouched, ready to be transported back to the church. I just forgot one thing. I forgot to measure the door to the church, and it couldn't fit through. Luckily for me, 1 brick could be removed from the corner, and with 1 millimeter to spare, we slid the transfer into the church. But can you imagine if this was a carved granite portal around the door? I would have really been in trouble. So it ended well, and here is the transfer with the epitaphium on the south wall and opposite the Romanesque painting. Now, you make only this kind of mistake only once in your career. So I can promise you that next time I had to do a transfer in 1996, the very first thing I did was to measure the door to the church, to make sure that the transfer mounted on its new support could fit through. This was also a close call, but I knew it would fit in. But it is not only this kind of mistake, an oversight, that can cause serious problems in a conservation project. Much of what we do isn't only dependent on ourselves. Sometimes there are many stakeholders, especially with working with public art. And the more people involved in a project, the greater the chances are of miscommunications. And sometimes the various stakeholders have different goals or preferred goals for a project, and sometimes promises are broken, as my next case story will show. This is the main building of the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Copenhagen, and the story is from 1996. But the background goes to 1962, when the artist Peter Nyborg painted a mural on the wall in one of the rooms used for representational purposes. In 1996, this room was supposed to be renovated, and a door was to be inserted in this place marked by the arrow. The architect responsible for this project, out of respect for the mural, wanted to build a false wall in front of it to preserve it there for the future. But there where the door was to be inserted, this area of the painting had to be detached. So this is the first layer of Japanese tissue with the animal skin glue, followed by gauze with canvas margins. And the painting was stripped off the wall, and the opening was broken through. The painting was attached to a honeycomb plate. This is the reverse side, so you can see how it's constructed. And the agreement was that it would be hidden together with the rest of the mural behind the false wall. Imagine my surprise where several years later, I was walking in a building in a different faculty of the Academy of Fine Arts, and I glanced into one of the offices, and I said, "Holy smokes, I know that painting." This was the transfer that the architect, it turned out, I didn't know this, he couldn't fit it in behind the false wall, and he put it into the basement where someone found it and decided it was a very nice abstract painting, which is mounted horizontally and not vertically. So it has taken on an identity of its own, separate from the mother painting. A similar thing happened to this mural painting, which is a mural painted by the Danish abstract expressionist painter Oscar Jorn in 1965 in the summer house of his friend. On the photograph here, he was an art dealer, Brajer. Before his death, Brajer donated this painting to the Modern Museum of Art outside of Copenhagen. It's a very, very large mural. It's 65 square meters, so it cannot be photographed, taken on one photograph. It stretches on beyond the standing figure. There's a mezzanine level, there's a back wall, and the corridor is also painted. It was detached in 1986, removed in 7 pieces, and this is how it is exhibited today. Not only taken out of context, but is hanging in the wrong order. So these pieces are shuffled. This is an example of blatant ignoring of the conservation plans for this project. These pieces, the supports for these paintings are prepared that they could lock together to recreate the 3-dimensional configuration of the room. But this did not go well with the curators who would rather exhibit these paintings as a series of easel paintings. This travesty can take place because of the abstract nature of the painting, as the previous example. Now, had this been a bucolic landscape with nymphs playing with bunny rabbits, the curator probably couldn't get away with it. As my next case story will show, I won't be showing a mural with nymphs or bunny rabbits, sorry. This is Heavenstead Church, and it is an old Romanesque building with later additions. As all Romanesque churches in Denmark, it had originally had 2 entrances, the women's entrance on the north and the men's entrance on the south. Sometime in the 16th century, the women's entrance was blocked, and a porch was built around the men's entrance so that from that time on, there was only one entrance to the church. This porch, by the way, in Danish is called the weapons house. This is where the men left their weapons upon entering the church. Today, the church has different needs, and older and handicapped people needed better facilities. So they received permission to build an annex on the north side of the church and connect it to the church through the blocked women's entrance. And this is the annex that was built, a combination cloakroom toilet facilities with a glass corridor attaching it to the north wall of the church. When this was finished, a mason started removing the bricks, the stones that blocked the entrance. When he reached to the innermost area around here, he pulled out a stone that was lime-washed because he got to the interior of the church, but he was clever enough to see beneath that lime wash, you could see some color. So the National Museum was called, and I came there to inspect the situation. The interior of the church was lime-washed. Here we have on the left side is the niche with the doorway. There are wall paintings in the apse of the church from the Romanesque period, and in the first nave, the first vault in the nave from the second half of the 16th century. But the architect who was responsible for this project never thought to check if there were any paintings in this niche. Oops, there were. In fact, if you see on the sides of the niche, you could see that this is a painting that continues around the entire lower walls in the church. A fact that was noted in a report from investigation that took place 2 or 3 decades before and was filed in the National Archive according to the rules. And the architect never thought, or he didn't do his homework. He didn't think that he should check the archives to see if there were any relevant documents. So I was asked to detach this painting. I decided to restore the painting before detaching, because detaching wall paintings is such a drastic procedure. There is a very big risk of losing some of the paint. In fact, I have never seen a detachment where no paint loss occurred. So the more there is of the pictorial contents from the start, the better it is at the end. Here you could see actually the hole where the mason pulled out that one stone where he discovered that there was a painting. But this time, I didn't want to press this painting down on a flat support. It was painted on a wall of boulders and rubble. So I had one of the archaeologists from the museum made a 3D scanning, make a 3D scanning of the surface. Now this was 2001, and technology has advanced now, but at that time I was very proud of myself that we did a 3D scanning with what they called a ferro arm, which you had to scan manually. It takes a reading every 5 millimeters, and then you go across, and then you go down 5 millimeters, and you go back. It takes several hours to scan a whole surface like this. But I was very proud to do this. In fact, I think I am the only person who ever attempted to recreate the 3D dimensional configuration of a wall painting that was transferred. So after I had this recorded, I'm now preparing the surface of the painting to apply the water-soluble animal skin glue. I'm impregnating the painting with paraloid, B72, and acrylic resin. And so now we're applying the animal skin glue with Japanese tissue and 2 layers of cotton gauze. Now, most of you probably know that animal skin glue is a highly hygroscopic material, and it can shrink very drastically. So, and this was done, we finished putting the facing on a Friday, and we wanted to go home for the weekend. This was a church about 4 hours drive from Copenhagen. So before leaving, I talked to the church warden, and I explained to him how important it was for the relative humidity not to be changed, that the drying of the facing should occur very slowly to prevent a spontaneous detachment of the painting. So when I came back on Monday, the painting had indeed spontaneously detached. What happened was that the church warden was not on duty that weekend, and he forgot to tell the person who was replacing him to not turn the heating on in the church. So the painting did uncontrollably detach itself. I remember standing over this, having the feeling of utter panic, similar to the one I had when I was standing outside of Morslet Church with my drapery transfer, all with my heart beating, and I was thinking, what am I supposed to do now? But after I calmed down, I examined the surface, and I could see that there were microscopic bits of color over the whole surface. There was enough to create a reconstruction of the painting without resorting to conjecture. So I rolled up the painting, and I took it to the conservation studio. I'm embedding a gauze on the backside to strengthen it. And while I'm working here, the carpenter is cutting profiles according to the computer readout of the 3D scanning. He prepared a thick slab of wood with 160 grooves that each of them would hold one of the profiles, and this is how I recreated the 3-dimensional configuration of the surface. This I covered with a layer of tape to separate it from the support, which I'm building on top right now. So I was layering, the next step was to layer on fiberglass and epoxy to build it up to about 1/3 of an inch thick. So all I wanted was this three-dimensional shell. After that, I wet the transfer and I pressed it onto the support and applied sandbags to press the painting down in all the nooks and crannies. And thus, I was able to recreate the three-dimensional configuration. The detail is shown in raking light, which exaggerates the surface configuration. But here is this finished transfer, which weighs about 40 kilograms, and it was hung in the church on the wall. A strange combination of an easel painting and a slab of the wall that is hanging up on the wall. The church community was very pleased with this result. We saved a part of the history of the church, and it was a good story. Now, comparing these two transfers of the doorway transfers, we could see that the pictorial contents really is important for the identity of a transfer. The transfer in the church really cannot take on an identity of its own. It belongs to the church, and it can never be displayed horizontally or upside down as the abstract transfer can be, which I will show in the next case. Nope, sorry, I deleted that next case story. Sorry. I would like to move away from the topic of transfers, because transfers are in itself a very controversial topic that have fueled many discussions about ethics and authenticity for many decades. I'd like to show you an example of a controversial project that took place on site in this church not too many years ago. The focus of this case story are the wall paintings in the chancel of the church. These wall paintings, dated 1275, are placed in the Danish Register of Wall Paintings in the highest category because of the pictorial contents. Depicted are Jewish figures of Jews with characteristic hats that are very rare in wall paintings. So in addition to its age, these are unique paintings because of the details of the figures. This is the main scene on the North Web, and I'd like to show you the details or go through it with you so you understand what this painting is about. Here we have Pontius Pilate, who is condemning Jesus to death. Jesus is standing here flanked by two jeering Jewish jailers. In the middle, he's being whipped by the two jailers here, and on the right side, he receives his cross. And these scenes are framed by a crenellated wall, and beyond the wall is the imaginary city of Jerusalem. So take a good look at this painting, because 25 years later, this is what it looked like. It was totally destroyed by salts. The reason this happened is complex. First of all, our knowledge of how to deal with salts is recently acquired. And treating salts on a wall painting is, to this day, is one of the biggest challenges for a wall paintings conservator. It's hard to imagine, but in 1984, when this painting was restored, the salt analysis were not routine. And the conservators performing this work were not aware that there was a lot of salts were in the materials. They didn't know that they should limit the use of water. The water dissolved the salts, which then migrate to the surface and precipitate, and this pushes off the painting and pulverizes the paint layer. Another equally important reason that this happened was that the church community did not follow recommended practice for heating in the church. There was an organist here that was always complaining about being cold, so they really turned on the heat, and they kept the heat on for long periods, which caused the relative humidity to fall and caused the precipitation of the salts on the wall painting. The third reason why this happened is that the procedure for initiating conservation projects can be very complicated. The churches in Denmark are owned by the church communities, and they are run by volunteer church councils that are elected every 6 years. Sometimes projects that are initiated by one church council are not continued by the next. It all depends on the level of engagement and the competence of the people that are running the church. Until 1920, funding for conservation of wall paintings was provided by the federal government. The decorations in the churches were considered to be part of the national heritage. Now, the paintings are still considered to be part of the national heritage, but they are no longer provided for by the federal government, who chooses to use their money to provide free medical care and free education for the citizens, but not the preservation of the cultural heritage. The church councils have to fend for themselves, and they have to find their own funding, and usually is provided for by private foundations. So as these bureaucratic procedures were dragging on for years in this church, the wall paintings started to flake off. Now, I have to say that this is not at all a typical situation in Denmark. In fact, this is the most drastic example I've ever encountered in my 28 years of working there. What we have here is not only a detachment and very serious flaking of the lime wash, the ground layer for the paint layer, but the paint layer itself, on top of the flaking ground layer, is completely disintegrated. It's like powder. Many places it's totally gone, or just small just traces are left of the painting. This did not happen overnight, but the situation was very serious before the alarm was raised. So as these bureaucratic procedures were taking place, the beautiful city of Jerusalem, which had survived 700 years, slowly disintegrated. Here's a detail in the encircled area that was completely reduced to powder. The spiders were our friends. The spider webs were preventing the flakes from falling to the floor. Where did these salts come from, and why is this case worse than any other wall painting that we have in Denmark? This is a photograph of the vault taken above in the space below the roof. And contrary to all the vaults in the Danish churches, which are built of bricks, this one is built of limestone blocks. These limestones were cut most likely from this quarry, which is located about 1 kilometer from the church, where the stones were cut from the face of a cliff. And the stones would fall down into the sea, into the bay, and rest in shallow water until the masons would harvest them and cut them into the appropriate shapes for building. All the while, they would be resting in seawater and soaking up sodium chloride. The church is encircled with the yellow circle, and the quarry is located around here. Our salt measurements show that there is a constant moving from the inner part of the vault to the surface. And what you see in the first column here is an enormous amount. This is a percentage of the material, which is salt content. Usually at 0.5% we see damage, where this is really a lot of salt. What we have here is a stone that is an endless reservoir of salts that we cannot extract by any currently known means. We have software that could tell us what salts are being precipitated at what temperature and what humidity. And we can see here the major salt event is occurring between 58 and 70% relative humidity, where you see a large hop here in the red arc, where there's a major amount of sodium chloride that is precipitating. And our measurements of the temperature and the relative humidity inside the church show that there's a lot of activity happening in this danger zone. So this is the scientific explanation of why these paintings were destroyed. What do we do in a situation like this? The church communities are not very happy when we tell them that the best thing they could do for the wall paintings is to remove the central heating. There was no heating in the church when these paintings were made, but then no one would come to a cold and damp church. In other churches where we had some salt problems, not as grave as these here, but we had other churches where there were similar problems, we solved them by separating the room with the wall paintings from the centrally heated church, the rest of the church, by installing a glass wall with a glass door that was only opened during the church ceremonies, and removing the heating from the room with the church. So this was done in Dübe Church and in Kirche Stillinge, and this is what we proposed in Strübe also. It wasn't proposed. This was the restoration of these paintings was contingent on this glass wall being installed. Here we have a very discreet glass wall. We have only metal hinges in the corners here. It's I walked into this glass wall many times. So it's not at all altering the room in the church. The very first thing we did, just to be able to touch the painting, was apply 3 coats of 10% paraloid B72. This in itself is a controversial treatment, and we pride ourselves in Denmark. We're actually known that we treat our lime-based wall paintings with lime-based materials. So this was the only painting that was ever treated with so much acrylic. The idea here was that the special environment we were creating in this climate chamber that we created there was preventing the movement of salts. The salts were kept in solution so that no salt movement, no moisture would be moving in the fabric. It wouldn't be precipitating. So the salts, we can't get rid of them. They're just staying in solution in the fabric. This was important, especially since after spraying the surface, we continued with a very strong acrylic dispersion to just attach the flakes back down to the plaster layer. So a lot of plastic went into this painting. When the surface was all stabilized, the aesthetic treatment commenced. And you could see on this photograph, I am again involved in a controversial project here. I would like to assure you that I've done very many projects, totally conventional conservation projects. I decided here that the best way to prevent a unnatural appearance, an overly pedantic or correct, lifeless appearance of the painting, was to emulate the condition I saw on the photograph from 1984 by cross-hatching lines in a denser or more open network that imitated the wear and tear I saw on the photograph. So the entire painting was, in effect, recreated with cross-hatched lines, which created this wear and tear that is so characteristic of medieval paintings that exist this day in our churches. The crosshatch lines are easily detectable from a close distance, and this was intentional because I didn't want to make a forgery. But standing even 3 feet away, they emulate this wear and tear and the patina of the surface. And no one is ever going to be, at least not in the near future, close enough to see these cross-hatched lines. From the floor, the painting looks very close to what it looks like on the photographs from 1984. So people standing on the ground level of the church, uninitiated, do not know that about 75 or 80% of the color has been replaced with cross-hatched lines. And this might in itself seem very controversial, but I was defending this action by applying this broader concept of authenticity, where I was saying that I was concentrating on the location and the authenticity of spirit and feeling. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking, am I really kidding myself here? This is a replica of something that seems to be authentic. I could be sitting in this armchair and saying this. I aspired to authenticity, but I never got beyond verisimilitude. And verisimilitude is the quality of seeming to be authentic. So we are very often wiser after the fact, and it's very easy to play judge when I'm presenting all these case stories to you in this manner in this presentation. And my colleagues in Denmark were a little bit nervous about me talking about these case stories. They were afraid that the reputation of Danish wall painting conservation would be ruined. But I disagree. I think that we could learn from these skeletons in our closet, in our striving for profession, which is a very laudable goal for our profession. And that's why it's important to share these case stories instead of sweeping them under the carpet and pretending outwardly that nothing bad ever happens in our conservation projects. With this last project I showed you, the recreation of the painting on the vault, I received both criticism and praise from my colleagues. In fact, they think this is the most controversial thing I have ever done. And one of them said to me, "Boy, you're never going to be able to publish this." And I said, "Nope, probably not. It's too controversial." I thank you for letting me share this with you today.